Cecilia's heart raced as she crept through the dark village, her bare feet barely making a sound on the dry, cracked earth. The small bag of coins she had saved from fetching water for neighbors felt heavy in her hands, but it was her only hope. Behind her, her uncle's house stood like a shadow, a place filled with pain and harsh words. She could still hear her aunt's sharp voice ringing in her ears. "You're useless, Cecilia, a burden." The words stung, but the beatings that followed were worse. Cecilia was 22, but she had never known freedom. Her parents had died when she was young, and since then, her uncle's family had treated her like a servant. She cooked, cleaned, and fetched water from the well for hours every day, only to be scolded and beaten for the smallest mistakes. Tonight, she had finally found the courage to run away. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a faint glow over the village. Cecilia moved quickly, her eyes darting around to make sure no one was watching. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure someone would hear it. She clutched her bag tighter, the coins inside clinking softly. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. As she reached the edge of the village, she paused and looked back one last time. The house where she had suffered for so long looked smaller now, but the memories were still big and painful. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "I can't stay here anymore. I have to go." The road ahead was long and unfamiliar, but Cecilia didn't care. She had heard stories about the city, a place where people had jobs, money, and freedom. She didn't know if the stories were true, but she was willing to take the risk. Anything was better than staying here. By dawn, she reached a bus stop at the edge of the village. A rickety old bus was waiting, its engine sputtering and coughing like it might give out at any moment. Cecilia hesitated for a moment, then climbed aboard. The bus was crowded with people, their faces tired and worn. She found a seat near the back and hugged her bag close to her chest. The journey was long and bumpy, but Cecilia didn't mind. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. She stared out the window as the bus rattled down the road, watching the village fade into the distance. "I'm free," she thought, though the word felt strange and unfamiliar. When the bus finally arrived in the city, Cecilia stepped off and immediately felt overwhelmed. The streets were noisy and chaotic, filled with people rushing past her. The buildings were tall and intimidating, their windows reflecting the bright sunlight. The air smelled of smoke and sweat, and the noise was deafening. Cecilia wandered aimlessly, clutching her bag tightly. She had no money left, no place to sleep, and no one to turn to. The city was nothing like she had imagined. It was big, loud, and scary. But she couldn't go back. She had to keep going. Days turned into weeks, and Cecilia struggled to survive. She slept in unfinished buildings, shivering under the cold night sky. She took odd jobs, washing dishes, sweeping floors, and carrying heavy loads for market traders. But it was never enough. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and exhaustion weighed her down. One day, while hawking oranges in the bustling market, Cecilia's life took an unexpected turn. A sleek black car sped past, its tires screeching as it narrowly missed her. The shock was too much. Cecilia's vision blurred, and she fainted, collapsing onto the dusty ground. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the face of a man stepping out of the car. Then, everything went dark. Gabriel was not a man who liked to be kept waiting. At 32, he was one of the most successful businessmen in the city, known for his sharp mind, cold demeanor, and relentless drive. He had built his empire from the ground up, and he didn't have time for distractions. His days were filled with meetings, deals, and the constant pressure to stay on top. That morning, Gabriel was already running late. His investors were waiting, and he was getting impatient. Now, as his driver swerved through the crowded streets, Gabriel checked his watch again. "I don't have time for this," he thought, tapping his fingers impatiently on the armrest. His sharp jaw was clenched, and his dark eyes were focused ahead. He hated being late. That's when it happened. A girl carrying a basket of oranges suddenly appeared in front of the car. The driver slammed on the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt. Gabriel's heart raced as he saw the girl collapse. "Stop the car!" he barked, stepping out before the vehicle had fully stopped. He knelt beside the girl, his expensive suit brushing against the dusty ground. She was young, probably in her early 20s, and her face was pale. Her clothes were worn, and her hands were rough, like she had been working hard all her life. Gabriel's driver rushed over. "Sir, should I call an ambulance?" "Yes, now!" Gabriel snapped, his voice sharp with urgency. He couldn't just leave her there. The ambulance arrived quickly and the girl was rushed to the hospital. Gabriel followed, his mind racing. He didn't have time for this, but something about the girl's fragile appearance made him stay. At the hospital, the doctors assured Gabriel that the girl would be fine. She had fainted from shock, but was otherwise unharmed. Gabriel sighed in relief. He had been ready to pay her off and leave, but something about her vulnerable expression made him pause. When Cecilia woke up, she found herself in a clean white hospital bed. The room was quiet, and the sunlight streaming through the window made everything look soft and warm. She blinked, trying to remember what had happened. A tall, handsome man stood by the window, his sharp features softened by the light. He turned when he noticed her stirring and stepped closer. "You're awake," he said, his voice deep and calm. "I'm Gabriel. I'm the one who, well, my car almost hit you. Are you all right?" Cecilia nodded, though her head was still spinning. Gabriel reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "This should cover any expenses." Cecilia stared at the money, her hands shaking. It was more than she had ever held in her life. But as Gabriel looked into Cecilia's eyes, something stirred in him. She looked so young, so vulnerable. Gabriel studied her for a moment. "Do you have a place to stay?" he asked. Cecilia hesitated, then shook her head. "No, sir." "A job?" Again she shook her head. Gabriel frowned. He wasn't one to get involved in other people's problems. His life was busy enough as it was. But something about Cecilia tugged at him. She looked so young, so lost. "I have a job for you," he said finally. "You can work as a maid in my house. It's not much, but it's better than sleeping on the streets." Cecilia's eyes filled with tears. A job? A roof over her head? It was more than she had dared to hope for. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling with gratitude. Gabriel nodded, though he felt a strange unease. He wasn't sure why he had offered her the job. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was something else. Either way, he couldn't take it back now. "Get some rest," he said, his tone softer now. "I'll have someone pick you up tomorrow." The next morning, a sleek black car arrived to pick Cecilia up. She climbed in nervously, clutching her small bag of belongings. The driver didn't say much, but he gave her a kind smile as they drove through the bustling city streets. Cecilia stared out the window, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. She had no idea what to expect. When the car pulled through the tall iron gates of Gabriel's mansion, Cecilia's jaw dropped. The house was enormous, with white walls and large windows that sparkled in the sunlight. The garden was filled with colorful flowers and tall trees, and a fountain bubbled in the center of the driveway. It looked like something out of a dream. Cecilia stepped out of the car, her eyes wide as she took in the grandeur of the place. She had never seen anything like it. The mansion was so big it felt like it could swallow her whole. Agatha, the housekeeper, greeted her at the door. She was a tall, thin woman with sharp eyes and a stern expression. Her voice was cold and clipped as she spoke. "You must be Cecilia," she said, looking her up and down. "Follow me." Cecilia nodded, her heart racing as she followed Agatha inside. The interior of the mansion was even more impressive than the outside. The floors were made of shiny marble, and the walls were decorated with beautiful paintings. A grand staircase led to the upper floors, and a crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, sparkling like diamonds. Agatha handed Cecilia a list of rules. "These are the rules of the house," she said, her tone firm. "Follow them, and you'll do fine. Break them, and you're out." Cecilia took the list and nodded again. "I understand," she said softly. Agatha gave her a quick tour of the house, showing her the kitchen, the dining room, and the rooms she would be responsible for cleaning. The mansion was so big that Cecilia wondered how she would ever remember where everything was. "Your room is downstairs," Agatha said, leading her to a small but clean room near the kitchen. It was simple, with a bed, a small table, and a closet. "You'll start work tomorrow morning. Be ready by 6. Cecilia thanked her and set her bag down on the bed. She felt a mix of emotions, gratitude for having a roof over her head, but also anxiety about the huge responsibility ahead of her. The next morning, Cecilia woke up early and got to work. She cleaned every corner of the massive house, scrubbing floors, dusting furniture, and polishing the silverware. She worked tirelessly, determined to prove herself. Gabriel was rarely home. He was a workaholic, always busy with meetings and business deals. But when he was home, Cecilia made sure to serve him diligently. She would bring him tea or snacks, always with a shy smile. At first, Gabriel barely noticed her. He wasn't used to paying attention to the staff, but over time, he began to notice her efforts. There was something about Cecilia that caught his eye. She was different from the people in his social circle, humble, hardworking, and kind. One evening, as Cecilia served him dinner, Gabriel looked up and smiled. "You've been doing a great job," he said. Cecilia blushed. "Thank you, sir." Gabriel's smile widened. "Call me Gabriel." From that day on, their relationship began to change. Gabriel began to talk to her more often. He would ask her about her life and her dreams, and Cecilia would answer shyly, surprised by his interest. She had never met anyone like him. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Gabriel asked her, "What do you want to do with your life, Cecilia?" Cecilia hesitated, then said, "I want to have a better life. I want to take care of myself and maybe, someday, have a family." Gabriel smiled. "That's a good dream," he said. "I hope you achieve it." Cecilia felt a warmth in her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt like someone cared about her. The mansion was quiet, except for the soft crackling of the fireplace in the living room. Cecilia sat on the edge of the plush sofa, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Gabriel sat across from her, his tie loosened and his face relaxed. It was late, and the rest of the staff had gone to bed. These quiet moments had become their secret ritual. "Tell me about your village," Gabriel said, leaning forward. His voice was warm, and his eyes sparkled with curiosity. Cecilia hesitated. She wasn't used to someone like Gabriel, someone so important, caring about her life. But over the weeks, he had shown her kindness she had never known. She began to speak, her voice soft but steady. She told him about the fields of maize, the sound of the river at dawn, and the way the sun painted the sky in colors of gold and pink. Gabriel listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face. "It sounds beautiful," he said when she finished. "I've traveled the world, but I've never seen anything like that." Cecilia smiled shyly. "It's home," she said simply. Gabriel reached across the space between them and gently took her hand. His touch was warm, and Cecilia's heart skipped a beat. "You're special, Cecilia," he said softly. "I've never met anyone like you." Cecilia's cheeks turned pink. She looked down at their hands, her mind racing. She had never imagined that someone like Gabriel, a man who owned companies, who lived in a mansion, who seemed to have everything, could care for her. But here he was, holding her hand and looking at her like she was the most important person in the world. I don't know what to say," she whispered. Gabriel smiled. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that I care about you. More than I've cared about anyone in a long time." Cecilia's heart swelled with happiness. As the weeks turned into months, Cecilia and Gabriel grew closer. They spent hours together, talking about their lives and dreams. Gabriel found himself drawn to Cecilia's warmth and sincerity, while Cecilia admired Gabriel's intelligence and ambition. But as their relationship deepened, they knew they had to keep it a secret. Gabriel's world was filled with judgmental eyes, and Cecilia was just a maid. For now, they were just happy to be together, without any interference. But their secret didn't stay hidden for long. Agatha, the housekeeper, had been watching from the shadows. She noticed the way Gabriel's eyes followed Cecilia when she entered a room. She noticed the way Cecilia's face lit up when Gabriel spoke to her. Agatha had worked for the family for years, and she knew trouble when she saw it. Agatha knew she had to do something. She had always been loyal to Gabriel's mother, Susan, and she had promised to keep her updated on anything unusual. This, she decided, was definitely unusual. One evening, after everyone had gone to bed, Agatha picked up the phone in the kitchen. Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed the number. "Mrs. Susan," she said in a low voice when the call connected. "There's something you need to know about your son." On the other end of the line, Susan's voice was sharp. "What is it, Agatha?" Agatha took a deep breath. "He's been spending a lot of time with the new maid. Too much time. I think he's grown fond of her." There was a long silence. When Susan finally spoke, her voice was icy. "A maid? My son? Involved with a maid? This is unacceptable." Agatha nodded, even though Susan couldn't see her. "I thought you should know." "You did the right thing," Susan said. "I'll handle this." When Susan hung up the phone, she was furious. She had always envisioned her son marrying someone of a similar social standing. She could not accept the thought of her son having an affair with a maid, so she immediately made plans to intervene. Susan arrived at the mansion a few days later. her presence as sharp and commanding as the click of her heels on the marble floor. She was a tall, elegant woman, with piercing eyes and a cold demeanor that could freeze even the warmest room. Her perfectly tailored dress and expensive jewelry screamed wealth and power, but her expression was anything but welcoming. She had always been a controlling woman, and the rumors about her son and the maid had reached her ears. She wasn't pleased. Gabriel was in his study when he heard the familiar sound of his mother's voice echoing through the halls. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Gabriel," Susan said as she entered the room, her voice icy. "What is this I hear about you and the maid?" Gabriel looked up from his desk, his jaw tightening. "It's none of your business, Mother." Susan's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It is my business when it affects our family's reputation. That girl is beneath our social status. You need to end this nonsense." Gabriel stood up, his tall frame towering over his mother. "Cecilia is not nonsense," he said firmly. "She's important to me." Susan let out a bitter laugh. "Important? She's a maid, Gabriel. A common girl with no family, no background, no future. Do you really think she belongs in our world?" Gabriel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "She's more than her background, Mother. She's kind, hard-working, and genuine, something you wouldn't understand." Susan's face flushed with anger. "How dare you speak to me like that? I've worked hard to build this family's reputation, and I won't let you ruin it over some foolish infatuation." The argument grew heated, their voices rising as they hurled accusations and frustrations at each other. Gabriel's frustration boiled over. "You can't control every aspect of my life, Mother. I'm not a child anymore." Susan's eyes flashed with fury. "As long as you carry our family name, I will have a say in your life, and I won't stand by while you throw it all away for a girl who means nothing." Gabriel's voice was low and steady, but his anger was palpable. "Cecilia means everything to me, and if you can't accept that, then maybe you don't belong in my life either." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and charged. Susan's face went pale, her lips trembling with rage. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Gabriel sank back into his chair, his chest heaving with emotion. He hated arguing with his mother, but he couldn't let her control him anymore. He had to stand his ground, even if it meant losing her. Meanwhile, Cecilia had been in the hallway, dusting a vase, when she overheard the argument. Her heart sank as she listened to Susan's harsh words. She felt a pang of guilt, her hands trembling as she clutched the duster. She didn't want to come between Gabriel and his mother. She didn't want to be the reason their relationship fell apart. When Gabriel found her later, she was sitting on the edge of her bed, her eyes red from crying. He knelt in front of her, his expression softening. "Cecilia," he said gently, "what's wrong?" She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "I heard you and your mother arguing," she whispered. "It's my fault. I shouldn't have come here. I'm causing trouble for you." Gabriel shook his head, taking her hands in his. "No, Cecilia, this isn't your fault. My mother has always been controlling, and this was bound to happen sooner or later. You're not the problem." Cecilia's voice trembled. "But she's your mother. I don't want to come between you." Gabriel squeezed her hands. "You're not coming between us. This is about me standing up for what I want, for who I care about. And I care about you, Cecilia, more than anything." Cecilia's heart swelled with emotion, but the guilt still lingered. She wanted to believe him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was causing more harm than good. As the days passed, the tension in the mansion grew. Agatha, the housekeeper, watched Cecilia with a cold, calculating gaze, her disapproval evident in every glance. She had always been loyal to Susan, and she didn't like the way Gabriel was treating Cecilia. One evening, as Cecilia was cleaning the dining room, Agatha approached her. "You think you're special, don't you?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Cecilia looked up, startled. I don't know what you mean." Agatha crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Don't play dumb. You think just because Gabriel is paying attention to you, you're something special. But you're not. You're just a maid, and you'll always be a maid." Cecilia's heart ached, but she held her head high. "I know my place, Agatha, but Gabriel has been kind to me, and I won't apologize for that." Agatha scoffed. "We'll see how long that lasts." As Agatha walked away, Cecilia felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. Life in the mansion was about to get a lot more complicated. Days passed, and Cecilia noticed something strange. Her body felt different, tired, achy, and sometimes nauseous. At first, she thought it was just stress from the tension in the mansion, but when the symptoms didn't go away, she began to wonder. One evening, after everyone had gone to bed, Cecilia sat on the edge of her small bed, holding a pregnancy test in her trembling hands. The result was clear. She was pregnant. Her heart raced as she stared at the test, a mix of emotions flooding her. Joy, because she was carrying Gabriel's child. Fear, because she didn't know how he would react. And uncertainty, because she had no idea what this would mean for her future. Cecilia wanted to tell Gabriel right away, but before she could, he received an urgent call. His voice was tense as he spoke on the phone, and when he hung up, he turned to her with a grim expression. "I have to go abroad for a business meeting," he said, running a hand through his hair. "It's an emergency. I'll be back as soon as I can." Cecilia's heart sank, but she forced a smile. "It's okay," she said softly. "Do what you need to do." Gabriel cupped her face in his hands, his eyes searching hers. "I'll miss you," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I'll miss you too," Cecilia whispered, her heart aching. She wanted to tell him about the baby, but the timing felt wrong. She decided to wait until he returned. It would be a surprise, she thought, a happy one. However, things didn't go as planned. The day after Gabriel left, Susan returned to the mansion. She arrived in a sleek black car, her sharp eyes scanning the property as if she owned it, which, in a way, she did. Cecilia was in the kitchen, preparing tea, when Agatha walked in with a cold expression. "Mrs. Susan wants to see you," Agatha said, her voice clipped. "In the sitting room, now." Cecilia's heart sank. She had a bad feeling about this, but she had no choice. She wiped her hands on her apron and followed Agatha to the sitting room. Susan was seated on the elegant sofa, her posture perfect, her expression icy. Beside her sat a glamorous young woman with perfectly styled hair and a designer dress that probably cost more than Cecilia could earn in a year. The woman looked at Cecilia with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "Cecilia," Susan said, her voice cold and sharp. "Sit down." Cecilia hesitated but obeyed, sitting on the edge of a chair across from Susan. Her hands trembled in her lap, and she felt like a child being scolded. "This is Natasha," Susan said, gesturing to the woman beside her. "Gabriel's fiancée." Cecilia's heart stopped. "Fiancé?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Susan's lips curled into a thin smile. "Yes, Gabriel has been engaged to Natasha for some time now. It's been kept quiet for reasons. But now, with all these rumors about you and him, it's time to set things straight." Cecilia felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice shaking. "Of course you didn't," Susan said dismissively. "But now you do. And you need to understand something, Cecilia. You don't belong here. You and Gabriel come from different worlds. These rumors about you two have made him a laughingstock in his social circle. It's harming his reputation and his business." Cecilia's eyes filled with tears. "I never meant to cause any trouble," she said softly. Susan leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "If you truly love him, you'll leave. You'll walk away and never look back. Stop interfering with his life and allow him to live the life he's meant to live. Do you understand?" Cecilia's heart shattered into a million pieces. She looked at Natasha, who was sitting silently, her expression unreadable. Then she looked back at Susan, who was waiting for her answer. "I understand," Cecilia whispered, her voice breaking. That night, Cecilia packed her few belongings into a small bag. Her hands shook as she folded her clothes, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't stay here, not after what Susan had said. She didn't want to be a burden to Gabriel, and she didn't want to ruin his life. As she slipped out of the mansion, the cool night air hit her face. She looked back at the grand house one last time, her heart heavy with sadness. She didn't know where she would go, but she couldn't stay. Cecilia walked for hours, her feet aching, until she reached a bus station. She bought a ticket to a small town far away, a place where no one would know her. She didn't have much money, but she had enough to start over. As the bus pulled away, Cecilia placed a hand on her stomach, where her baby, Gabriel's baby, was growing. "I'll take care of you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I promise." A few days later, Gabriel returned home after his trip, exhausted but eager to see Cecilia. He had missed her more than he expected, and he couldn't wait to tell her about his trip. But as he walked into the mansion, his heart sank. His mother, Susan, was sitting in the living room with Natasha, the woman she had introduced as his fiancée. Gabriel's eyes scanned the room, searching for Cecilia. She was nowhere to be seen. His stomach twisted with unease. "Where's Cecilia?" he asked, his voice sharp. Susan looked up, her expression calm but cold. "She left," she said simply, as if it were no big deal. Gabriel's jaw tightened. "What do you mean she left?" Susan shrugged. "She decided it was best to go. I think she realized she didn't belong here." Gabriel's hands clenched into fists. He knew his mother had something to do with this. "What did you say to her?" he demanded, his voice rising. Susan's eyes narrowed. "I simply told her the truth, that she doesn't belong in our world, that she's causing problems for you and your reputation." Gabriel's anger boiled over. "You had no right," he shouted. "Cecilia is important to me, and you drove her away." Susan stood up, her voice icy. "I did what was best for this family. You need to marry someone like Natasha, not some common maid." Gabriel turned to Natasha, who was sitting quietly, her expression unreadable. "You," he said, pointing at her. "Get out of my house, now." Natasha's eyes widened, but she didn't move. Susan stepped in. "Natasha is staying," she said firmly. "She's the woman I've chosen for you, and you will respect that." Gabriel felt a wave of frustration and disappointment. He wanted to throw them both out, but he couldn't. Despite everything, Susan was still his mother, and he couldn't bring himself to go that far. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth, "but I'm leaving." Before leaving, Gabriel turned to Agatha, who had been standing quietly in the corner. "You're fired," he said, his voice cold. "I don't want to see you when I return." Agatha's face paled. "But sir?" "You betrayed my trust," Gabriel interrupted. "You sided with my mother instead of being loyal to me. I don't need people like you in my life." Gabriel stormed out of the mansion, his heart pounding with anger and pain. He got into his car and drove around the city, searching for Cecilia. He went to the market where they had first met, asking everyone if they had seen her, but no one had. Days turned into weeks, but Cecilia was nowhere to be found. Gabriel grew more desperate with each passing day. He couldn't concentrate on work, and his heart ached with regret. He blamed himself for going on that trip. If he had stayed, maybe none of this would have happened. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Susan was growing increasingly worried. She had tried calling Gabriel multiple times, but he refused to answer. Since the day he had stormed out, he hadn't returned to the mansion. As the days passed, Susan began to notice things about Natasha that she hadn't before. The woman was beautiful and well-dressed, but that was all she had going for her. She was lazy, spending her days scrolling through her phone and shopping. She treated the staff with arrogance, ordering them around as if they were beneath her. One day, Susan came home early from an event and overheard Natasha on the phone. At first, she didn't think much of it, but then she heard her son's name. Curious, she hid and listened. What she heard made her blood run cold. Natasha was plotting with her secret lover to kill Gabriel after they get married and take over his properties. They laughed as they discussed their plan, as if it were some kind of game. Susan's heart pounded as she realized the kind of woman she had been forcing her son to be with. Horrified and enraged, she stormed into the room. "Get out of my house!" she shouted, her voice trembling with anger. Natasha's eyes widened in shock. "What are you talking about?" "I heard everything," Susan said, her voice cold. "You're a monster, and you're not getting anywhere near my son." Enraged, Susan ordered Natasha to be thrown out of the house. She also reported her to the police. That night, Susan sat alone in the mansion, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, she realized how her desire to control Gabriel's life had caused him so much pain, and had almost cost him his life. As the days passed, Susan's regret grew. She had been so focused on maintaining their family's reputation that she had lost sight of what truly mattered, her son's happiness. She wanted to make it up to him, to find Cecilia and bring her back, but there was still no news of her. Disappointed and weighed down by guilt, Susan decided to visit the small town that always brought her a sense of peace. It was a place she went to when the noise and chaos of the city became too much. As her car drove through the quiet streets, Susan stared out the window, lost in thought. Her mind was a whirlwind of regret and sorrow. She had been so wrong about Cecilia, so wrong about everything. Then, her eyes caught sight of a familiar face. Cecilia was walking down the street, heavily pregnant and carrying a big basket of foodstuffs. She was sweating, her face flushed from the effort, but she kept going, determined and strong. Susan's heart sank as she watched her. Guilt washed over her like a tidal wave, and she remembered how her actions had driven Cecilia away. "Stop the car," Susan ordered her driver, her voice trembling. The car pulled over, and Susan stepped out. She approached Cecilia slowly, not knowing what to say. Cecilia looked up and froze when she saw Susan. The two women stood face to face, the air heavy with the weight of the past. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Susan broke down in tears. "Cecilia," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry. For everything." Cecilia's eyes widened in surprise. She had never expected to see Susan again, let alone hear her apologize. "Mrs. Susan," she said softly, unsure of what to say. Susan wiped her tears, her voice trembling. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything. I wanted what was best for Gabriel, but I went about it all wrong. I hurt you, and I hurt him, and now—" She glanced at Cecilia's swollen belly, her heart breaking. "Now you're pregnant with another man's child, and I've ruined any chance of you and Gabriel being together." Cecilia's eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Susan," she said gently, "these babies, they're Gabriel's." Susan's breath caught in her throat. "What?" Cecilia placed a hand on her belly. "I'm carrying twins. Gabriel's twins." For a moment, Susan couldn't speak. She stared at Cecilia, her mind racing. Then, tears of joy streamed down her face. "Twins," she whispered. "Gabriel's twins?" Cecilia nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. "Yes." Susan felt a wave of emotions she hadn't felt in years: joy, relief, and hope. She reached out and took Cecilia's hands in hers. "Oh, my dear," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been such a fool. Please let me make this right. Let me take you back to the city. You shouldn't be living like this, not while you're carrying my grandchildren." Cecilia hesitated. She had built a life for herself in the small town, but it was a hard life. Her room was small, with cracked walls and a leaky roof. She had used her savings to start a small business selling foodstuffs in the market, but it was barely enough to get by. "I don't know," Cecilia said softly. "I've made a life here, and Gabriel. I don't know if he even wants to see me." Susan's heart ached. "Cecilia, Gabriel has been miserable since you left. He's been searching for you everywhere. He loves you, and I know he'll be overjoyed to know about the babies." Cecilia's eyes filled with tears again. She missed Gabriel more than she could put into words, and she wanted her children to have a better life, a life she could never give them on her own. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered, "I'll come back with you." Susan's face lit up with relief. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. They drove back to the city together, the tension between them slowly easing as they talked. Cecilia told Susan about her life in the small town, how she had rented the room with her savings, how she had started her small business, and how she had been saving every penny to prepare for the babies. Susan listened, her heart breaking as she realized how much Cecilia had struggled. When they arrived at the mansion, Susan made sure Cecilia had everything she needed. She gave her a comfortable room, arranged for a doctor to check on her, and made sure she was well taken care of. Cecilia felt overwhelmed by Susan's kindness. She had never expected this from the woman who had once driven her away. As Cecilia settled in, Susan couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. She had made so many mistakes, but maybe, just maybe, she could make things right. Susan wanted to make everything right, but she knew her son didn't want to see her. The guilt of her past actions weighed heavily on her heart. She had driven Cecilia away, and in doing so, she had hurt Gabriel deeply. But now, with Cecilia back in the mansion and carrying Gabriel's twins, Susan saw a chance to fix what she had broken. She called Gabriel's secretary and asked her to deliver a message. "Tell him I've found Cecilia." When the secretary relayed the message, Gabriel was skeptical at first. He thought it might be another one of his mother's tricks to manipulate him, but the thought of Cecilia, his Cecilia, being found was too much to ignore. He picked up the phone and called his mother, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. When the call connected, Gabriel's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't his mother's voice on the other end, it was Cecilia's. "Gabriel?" Her soft voice trembled. "Cecilia, he breathed, his voice filled with emotion. "Is it really you?" "Yes," she said, tears in her voice. "I'm at the mansion." Without another word, Gabriel hung up and rushed to his car. His heart pounded as he drove to the mansion, his mind racing with hope and fear. What would he say to her? How could he make up for everything that had happened? When he arrived, he burst through the doors of the mansion, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Cecilia. She was standing in the living room, her belly swollen with pregnancy, her face glowing with a mix of joy and nervousness. Gabriel's breath caught in his throat. He approached her slowly, as if afraid she might disappear if he moved too quickly. "Cecilia," he whispered, his voice breaking. Tears streamed down Cecilia's face as she looked at him. "Gabriel," she said softly. They stood face to face, the weight of everything they had been through hanging in the air. Then Gabriel reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he never wanted to let go. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "For everything. I should have been there for you. I should have protected you." Cecilia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry too," she whispered. "I should have trusted you. I shouldn't have left." Gabriel pulled back slightly, his hands resting on her shoulders. "You're here now?" he said, his voice filled with relief. "That's all that matters." Cecilia took his hand and placed it on her swollen belly. "Gabriel," she said softly, "these are our babies." Gabriel's eyes widened as he felt the gentle movement beneath his hand. "Twins?" he whispered, his voice filled with awe. Cecilia nodded, tears of joy in her eyes. "Yes, twins." Gabriel felt a wave of emotions he couldn't even name: joy, relief, love. He pulled Cecilia into his arms again, holding her tightly. "I love you," he said, his voice firm, "and I'm never letting you go again." From the corner of the room, Susan watched the couple with tears in her eyes. She was happy that they had found their way back to each other, but her heart ached with regret. She had been the reason for their separation, and she wondered if her son would ever forgive her. Quietly, she slipped out of the mansion and returned to her own house, giving the couple the space they needed. Over the next few months, Gabriel and Cecilia grew closer than ever. Gabriel prepared for the arrival of the babies, making sure everything was perfect. He hired the best doctors, decorated the nursery, and spent every moment he could with Cecilia. One evening, as they sat together in the nursery, Cecilia looked at Gabriel and said, "You should try to forgive your mother. She made mistakes, but she's trying to make things right." Gabriel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know," he said. "It's just hard to forget everything she did." Cecilia placed a hand on his arm. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about letting go of the pain so you can move forward." Gabriel looked at her, his heart swelling with love. "You're amazing, you know that?" Cecilia smiled. "I just want our family to be happy." Finally, the day came when Cecilia went into labor. Gabriel and Susan waited anxiously at the hospital, their hearts pounding with fear and hope. Hours felt like days, but finally, the doctor came out with a smile. "Congratulations," the doctor said. "You have a healthy baby boy and a healthy baby girl, and the mother is doing just fine." Gabriel and Susan breathed a sigh of relief, their faces breaking into smiles. They rushed to see Cecilia and the babies, their hearts filled with joy. Cecilia was exhausted but glowing as she held the twins in her arms. Gabriel sat beside her, his eyes filled with tears as he looked at his children. "They're perfect," he whispered. Susan stood by the door, her heart swelling with love and regret. She had almost lost all of this because of her mistakes. But now, she was determined to make things right. They named the babies John and Jane. As the days passed, Gabriel watched his children grow and began to understand his mother a little more. He realized that, like him, she had just been trying to do what she thought was best. One evening, Gabriel sat down with Cecilia and said, "I think it's time to let go of the past. I want my mother to be a part of our lives, of our children's lives." Cecilia smiled. "I think that's a good idea." When Susan moved into the mansion, she thanked Gabriel and Cecilia for giving her a second chance. "I promise," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "I will never interfere in your lives again. I just want to be a part of this family." Gabriel nodded, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. "We're glad to have you, Mother." When the twins were 6 months old, Gabriel proposed to Cecilia. He gave her a grand wedding, filled with love and joy. On the wedding day, Susan held John and Jane in her arms, tears of happiness streaming down her face. As Gabriel and Cecilia danced together, he whispered in her ear, "Thank you for coming into my life and making it so much brighter. I promise to cherish you forever." Cecilia smiled, her heart full. "I love you, Gabriel." And so they all lived happily ever after. Susan learned to respect her son's decisions and spent her days doting on her grandchildren. Gabriel and Cecilia's love grew stronger with each passing day, and their family became a symbol of forgiveness, love, and new beginnings. Thanks for watching, dear viewers. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel. What do you think about Gabriel and Cecilia's story? I would love to know your thoughts in the comments.